What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in this video I wanted to go over my favorite cars to use on slaloms on the game here. So I'm sure the slaloms are probably going to be one of the most important skills to actually have a good vehicle on, and or have a good set to run as well, because it seems like the slaloms do show up in many of the summits in the game. I would say almost every summit has at least one of them, and or a majority of the summits. Sometimes even might have one or two of them as well, so having a good vehicle for these is definitely going to be a plus and or really give you a good advantage. I originally messed with a lot of the vehicles in the street class to really test out how they would actually be with many of these slaloms, and to be honest, the best one I found so far is going to be the Berlinetta here. Now, what's kind of funny is I was testing out many of the other street vehicles in the game, and I honestly was just not liking them. You would honestly think a lot of the bikes would probably do really good on these slaloms, but to be honest, I was just not liking the way a lot of these cars were handling and or the way some of them were doing either. Now, I'm not going to lie though, if you really wanted to, you could probably run like the Honda CBR here, but again, I was just not into the way this thing was driving, to be honest. I mean, if you were to run one of the bikes on the slaloms, I would honestly recommend just running one of the touring bikes. I feel like that's probably going to be the best option. But for me, guys, I would highly recommend running the lovely Berlinetta here. This car is honestly really good. Not only is this car going to be really good for slaloms, but if you wanted to race it, I feel like it's going to be a really good option for these shorter tracks. The only thing that hurts this vehicle is indeed going to be the lower top speed on it, but luckily for slalom, so that's really not going to matter. I really do like the way this car accelerates, and it also handles really good. Not only that, I really do feel like the F12 is going to be really underrated, because some of these cars in the street category do seem to be really dang good for the most part. But for the F12 here, I would say running this car in manual and flying around with a score breaker set on these slaloms is definitely going to get you around 155,000 points with no issues at all. Not only because of the way this car drives, but the way this thing handles is going to be really good. I would say a lot of players are probably wondering if the Berlinetta here is going to be a good viable option for using this thing on off-road slaloms, and unfortunately one thing I do have to admit though is if you guys were to run the Berlinetta, you're most likely not going to have as many points and or be as fast as some of the rally raid cars, which I guess would make sense because, they're kind of made for off-roading and all that good stuff. But if you really wanted to, you could still easily get like 154 to 155,000 points with the Ferrari, which is only going to probably put you around 1,000 point difference on those. And you normally can make up those points in the other events. And you don't have to run one of the crazy score breaker sets either, because I've been getting most of my scores on these slaloms with just a regular score breaker set. And now moving over to what is probably known as the most used class in the Crew 2 at the moment is going to be the hypercars. So for this one, guys, there's a few vehicles I do want to go over with this one. And to be honest, I would say you could probably run a majority of the hypercars on the slaloms, but I have found a few of these to be a lot better than others here. So starting off with my first favorite is indeed going to be the Koenigsegg Regera, which I was actually running this vehicle for the escapes as well. This car is honestly going to be absolutely incredible for skills in general, so I would highly recommend picking up the Regera if you guys were thinking about it. I honestly really do love running this vehicle and most of the skills here because it's honestly just that good, and this car is not only really good for those, but also it's really stable and very easy to use. And if you guys do like running manual, I would recommend taking a look at like the Bugatti Divo, but honestly, for the slaloms, you really don't need that because of the way this vehicle is. I mean, it's basically one gear, you pretty much just accelerate, and what's kind of funny is for being a hypercar, for some odd reason, the Regera doesn't struggle at all on the off-road areas, which I really don't understand how that's possible. But then again, could you all imagine if we could actually get like a rally raid Koenigsegg in the Crew 2? That would honestly be the most insane thing ever. But I would definitely say that's going to be pretty far-fetched, because how are they actually going to add a lifted Koenigsegg into the game? Even though recently Lamborghini did just show a lifted Huracan, my goodness, imagine if that made its appearance. I would say the biggest issue with something like that is obviously going to be the balancing, but nonetheless though, guys, the Koenigsegg Regera might honestly be a jack of all trades. This car is pretty incredible. I'm sure if you really wanted to as well, you could probably run this vehicle on actual hyper races if you would like to, but for me personally, I'm normally running this vehicle on most of the skills in the game. Like there's an off-road escape, I normally will pick the Koenigsegg Regera and or the Bugatti Divo, but I would say the Koenigsegg is just going to be a better option in many ways. I really do like the way this car is geared on how it is, because even if you are running manual, the car is technically an automatic as well, but the way this thing accelerates, especially depending on the perks you guys are running, like I did notice Muddy might help the car a little bit. I might end up making a video in the future about that, because I do feel like having the Muddy perk on your set does actually help the car a little bit with its speed, but I noticed with the slaloms though, with the Koenigsegg here, I could easily get 155,000 points, and this car doesn't struggle at all even off-road. Now, what's really funny about this is I was originally only going to use the Koenigsegg Regera for this category because I really do feel like that car is honestly that amazing, but one of the other vehicles I wanted to add into this that I also think deserves another look for slaloms, but also going to be used for escapes as well, is going to be the Lamborghini Egoistia. Honestly, I probably pronounced that car wrong because my goodness, this thing looks like an absolute spaceship, but by far one of the coolest looking cars in the game, but also one of the most iconic. Not only that, but the Lamborghini here is going to be a really good car overall to use in the game itself, and I was testing this thing out a good amount on the slaloms, and I was honestly really impressed with it. This thing handles very nicely, it doesn't struggle at all, and what's kind of funny about that is even on the off-road slaloms, I was running this car and still easily getting 155k with a regular score breaker set, which honestly is pretty insane. You do not actually have to use the really insane score breaker set if you guys don't have it. I was noticing with the insane score breaker set, I think it's 87% that thing gets. You actually don't have to have that because on the summits, it doesn't seem like it really gives you that much of an actual advantage, which is probably a good thing. That way it gives every player a chance to really go after, the highest points possible on those. And the Egoista, which I do believe that's a little bit closer to the actual name of the Lamborghini, is probably going to be one of the best overall options for pretty much anything off-road, which honestly does not make any sense in an actual sentence because you would never think a Lamborghini could fly down a mountain as good as it does and or do an off-road slalom, weaving in and out of objectives similar to like a motorcycle test or something like that and actually doing it really good. I would definitely say the Lamborghini here is going to be a really good vehicle for pretty much all of that. And if you guys were looking for something to really mix up the gameplay, this crazy looking car really is going to be worth a look because not only is it going to be really good for slaloms and easily getting you into that higher point bracket, you could also run this thing on escapes and still get a really good score. And now moving over to what is widely known as probably the most used class for slaloms here is going to be the rally raid cars, and I would say that's probably going to be for good reasoning. For one, guys, not only are the rally raid vehicles going to be the best for off-road, which I know that's kind of a shocker, but it was also the first class to have that crazy score breaker set. So for the rally raid vehicles though, I would definitely say some are going to be better than others, and my first pick on this class is going to be the Ram 1500 Rebel. I've actually been running this truck a lot as well on pretty much many of the events in the game, and to my surprise I would say this thing is going to be really good for slaloms. One of the only issues I would say with the truck is the fact that if you guys are running manual, this thing is going to have 8 gears, so expect to shift this thing pretty often. You can also be in the wrong gear pretty easily, but for slaloms though, with the way this thing handles, not only that, but the stability on the Ram does seem to be really good from what I have noticed, and that's probably one of the main reasons why I always run this truck on many of the races. I love how this thing can get around turns and the way it can actually fly out of them. Not only that, but this truck just feels very planted compared to some of the others. There's definitely probably a lot of things people really do go after when looking at the vehicles they want to use for slaloms and or racing. I would say one of the biggest factors about some of the rally raid vehicles is they can definitely get loose pretty easily. I have been noticing that with testing some of them out, but luckily the Ram here is not going to get loose like that, and this truck can easily fly around the corners for racing and or easily get to the objectives for the slaloms as well. I'm honestly really impressed with this vehicle, and what's kind of funny though is I started using this truck out of nowhere. But there is one more vehicle I wanted to add into the Rally Raid category here for slaloms, and that's going to be the Land Rover Defender. What's kind of funny, guys, I was looking at something like the Raptor Enforcer unit, which is probably going to be one of the best Rally Raid vehicles in the entire game, but I was like, you know what, let me go take a look at some of these other cars and see how they do. So I was looking into the Land Rover, and it turns out this truck is all over the leaderboards in the game. It really did get me thinking a lot though, because I have been noticing the Land Rover showing up in many of the leaderboards in the game. So I was like, you know what, I really have to test this vehicle out right now to see why it's so good. So the first thing I noticed about the Land Rover is probably going to be the way this thing actually accelerates. I've been noticing, guys, it seems to be pretty dang fast for the most part. And even running something like manual, you can find yourself flying through the gears very quickly, and it seems to get up to speed very nice as well, which is definitely going to be a plus for these slaloms. I have been noticing on many of the slaloms recently that many players do like getting head starts on them, which is honestly going to be a really good idea, but what's kind of hilarious is I honestly never actually do that. I normally just start off on the slalom and then go as fast as I possibly can. I was also noticing the Land Rover is going to have really good handling and stability. That's going to be perfect for swerving back and forth on these slaloms as well. I really do think this is pretty awesome though, because now we're having more of these other vehicles in these classes being used a lot more often, and players are also starting to discover how good some of them actually are. That's honestly why I've been really trying to test out many of these vehicles in different things like skills and races, because I really do feel like many of the cars in the Crew 2 are most likely underrated. And now moving over to one of the other classes I have been finding myself using very often for these slaloms is going to be the Rallycross cars. So I'm not going to lie guys, many of the Rallycross vehicles are said to not have that good of stability and handling. That's most likely why many people probably run the Mitsubishi and or the Cadillac Enforcer unit, because vehicles like the Citroen here and or like the Lancia, I feel like some of these cars really do feel very unstable, and I honestly would not even bother touching any of these because of that reason. Some cars really aren't all that bad, but when you have vehicles that aren't that good with stability, and not only that, their speed isn't going to be all that good, I would say it's probably going to be really hard to pick some of them and actually use them for pretty much anything. So one of my favorite vehicles I have been running in the Rallycross class that's not going to be a quote-unquote meta vehicle is indeed going to be the Ford Fiesta. I honestly have not seen many people run this car in the game, which is kind of odd because it really is that good. But what's also kind of hilarious is I have been running the Ford Fiesta on many of the events as well, like races in the summits. I may not do as good as some of the cars like the Cadillac and or the Mitsubishi, but you can still get a pretty dang decent score for the most part and definitely hang on top with some of the better vehicles. But not only that guys, having a car like this for these slaloms is honestly really fun. Now, I'm not gonna lie though, you actually don't have to use a rallycross vehicle at all because of the rally raid cars, but I feel like one of the things that make the Crew 2 so much fun is the fact that you really can mix up the gameplay so much. So once I discovered you can actually run other vehicle classes on the slaloms, I immediately jumped into a rallycross vehicle, and of course my first option was indeed the Ford Fiesta, because why would I pick anything else? And my goodness, this car did a really good job. I was scoring around 154 to around 155,000 points, and I noticed I was scoring within like 1,000 points of most of the other vehicle classes in the slaloms, and I was even using this thing on some of the track ones as well, and my goodness, the Ford Fiesta is definitely a really fun option to use on these, and I highly recommend trying out some of the rallycross cars on the slaloms, because not only does it mix up the gameplay, but they can easily compete with some of the better vehicles, even with a regular scorebreaker set. But now moving over to the powerboat class is going to be very important as well. So for this one, I would probably say many players have been running the 1414 Demon, because this boat is definitely going to be really good for slaloms as well. But I really do think, guys, there's going to be a better option. For me personally, I normally run the 1414 Demon on basically all the escapes, and when it comes to everything else, I basically only use the Vector V40R. Now, one of my favorite things about this boat compared to the 1414 Demon is the way this boat actually handles. I have been noticing doing slaloms with it I do think are going to be a lot easier, especially doing those really tight like 180 turns and or those 90-degree turns where you have to turn all the way around. I really do feel like this boat is going to be a way better option for that. And one of my favorite things about the Vector is the fact that I do find it a lot easier to weave in and out of the cones as well. I would say the 1414 Demon can easily do them, but for some odd reason, guys, I would just prefer that boat on the escapes, because let's be honest, I would say the 1414 Demon is by far one of the fastest boats in the entire game, and is probably most likely the most used boat in the game as well, which is probably for good reasoning, because the 1414 Demon is really just that good, and if you really wanted to, you could probably run that boat on the slaloms as I did mention before. But if you haven't tried out the Vector V40R, I would honestly take a chance and try that thing out. I really do think this boat is one of my favorite things to use on the slaloms. It's basically my go-to boat for those. It's pretty much the only reason I actually use the Vector, besides maybe running this thing on an escape once in a while. But the way this boat can handle and fly around turns and or pretty much fly around the objectives when weaving in and out of the cones, I really do think is going to make the Vector a lot better than the 1414 Demon, I've also tested out the 1414 Demon and the V40R a good amount, so I would say both of these boats are going to be good for their own thing. But then again, many players probably run the 1414 Demon for pretty much all of it, like racing, escapes, and slaloms, which I can definitely understand where you guys are coming from with that. But again, I highly recommend trying out the Vector because even to this day, this is literally the only boat I run on the slaloms because the handling on this boat I feel like is going to be unmatched. But now moving over to one of the other classes I have been finding myself using a lot is going to be the touring cars and or the touring bikes for that matter. So for me guys, I have been talking a lot about the Ducati Panigale R. Even in the past, I would say this is probably the best touring bike in the game. But one thing I also recommend trying is to use this thing on many of the slaloms. I have been finding myself running this bike on many of those and I've been having an absolute blast with it. Not only is the handling on the bike obviously going to be really good, but using a motorcycle on these is going to be an awesome option as well because the bikes are going to be a lot smaller, so it's most likely going to be a lot easier to actually get around the objectives a little bit quicker, and you don't have to run around and or move the vehicle around as much as if you were using a car. But if you really wanted to though, you could easily run one of your favorite vehicles and probably still get a really good score. You could even jump on one of the MotoGP bikes and probably get a great score as well in the summits because even running a regular score breaker set with the Ducati, I'm normally around 1000 points in between some of the better vehicles and or the higher end like score breaker sets on like the Rally Raid and or the one on the Hypercar class as well. Now we're also going to have some parts on the street category, so even running a regular score breaker set with the Ducati, because of the speed you can have on the slaloms here, I would say you could easily compete with them. What I've been finding myself doing recently is basically mixing up the gameplay a lot. I'll do one on like the Ducati, and then the next week I'll use like the Ford Fiesta and basically mix it up. But I'm still finding myself scoring very close to everybody else running these crazy scorebreaker sets, so it's most likely going to come down to what you guys really want to use. But if you're a fan of bikes though and or you want that agility, I would highly recommend trying out the touring bikes over the street category ones. I really do feel like they're going to be a lot better, but not only that, they're also going to have better handling and an overall better speed as well. And now finally guys, moving over to my last favorite vehicle to run on the slaloms here is probably not going to be a bit of a shocker. It's indeed going to be an Alpha GP car, and for this one, I actually was testing out some of the other ones, and I would admit though, the Alpha Mark X is probably going to be pretty dang good and was actually one of my favorite cars to use back in the day, at least using this thing on slaloms compared to every other Alpha GP car out at the time. Now I'm basically finding myself running the KTM Expo R on many of them as well. What's kind of funny about this though is you really could mix this up very easily because the KTM is going to have some of the best handling in the entire game, and one thing I was also noticing with the KTM though is a lot of players are probably not big fans of this car, the way this thing can feel kind of twitchy. I can definitely see where you guys are coming from with that, so if you were to use this vehicle on a slalom, do keep that in mind. This car can get kind of twitchy sometimes and or feel kind of unstable, most likely because of the agility it has, and that might have been some type of way they could nerf the vehicle compared to some of the other ones. But even with the KTM Expo being a little bit more unstable, I would still highly recommend trying this car out on many of the slaloms. One thing I do recommend though, by the way guys, I would not actually try to use this vehicle on the off-road ones. Unfortunately, being an Alpha GP car, I noticed these are honestly terrible on the off-road slaloms, which I would say is probably not going to be shocking to pretty much anybody because who is actually going to take an Alpha GP car off-road? That would probably make no sense whatsoever, so you will only be able to run the KTM on any of the track-focused slaloms, which I would still say is going to be a really good option. It's going to make it a lot more fun, that way you can actually mix it up and try out other vehicle classes and still easily score next to some of the better vehicles and or some of the better classes with some of those crazy sets. So at least you're going to have a really big variety of different vehicles to run, and I was also running some really hilarious vehicles in this as well. I found myself using a drift car with a scorebreaker set, which by the way on some of the tracks, this is actually going to work, which is honestly kind of funny because you would never expect that to make any sense whatsoever. But you can also score very close to some of the better classes in the game with those crazy scorebreaker sets. So it really is going to come down to what vehicle you guys really like to run the most, but I'm really happy there's going to be a lot of variety on the crew too, and a lot more players are probably mixing this around using different vehicles as well with different sets to really see what they actually want to use on these slaloms. Let me know what you guys think about this in the comments below, and here are the settings for all the vehicles I was using in this video.